which it now is. So good afternoon and welcome to our members and all of our guests for the FCS 2022 Comms Provider event. During today's event, we're going to cover some key areas that we think are of very high interest to members. Firstly, we're covering switching of fixed voice and broadband, and we have guest speakers Paul Bradbury, Dave Stubbs, Megan Corcoran and Lee Turner, covering the details of both residential and business switching. And then the second item this afternoon, we have Juliet Scott from Openreach, who will be covering the move to all IP. And finally this afternoon, we'll have Tim Cowan and James Roswell covering competition in wholesale and resale markets. As we go through each session, we certainly welcome your questions. Can you please raise those in the Q&A area at the bottom of your Zoom screen? If you could please just type your question in there. And then at the end of each of the three topics, we'll hold a panel session during which the panel members will attempt to answer all of your questions, hopefully if time permits. If we do run short of time for all of the Q&A, we will have that written record of all your questions and do our best to get back with answers to all of them after the event. And while we feel that it's exactly the right thing to hold this year's event online, we are already planning to make a return to face-to-face events for FCS next year. And I'm sure that will be welcome after a few years of online events. We'll be very interested to have your feedback on that question. With regards to the face-to-face event and the opportunities that brings with it for greater networking and time to have greater involvement and discussion with the FCS and our guests and exhibitors. Before we move into the first session, I would very much like to thank our long-term member, Magrathea, for sponsoring this year's event. It certainly is very much appreciated. And I'll now hand over to Steve Kerr, who's going to be our MC ringside for today's event.
Thank you, David. To start us off in the first switching session today, we have Paul Bradbury, the chair of the One Touch Switching Company. Paul will provide an overview of One Touch switching for residential of fixed voice and broadband orders, and that's mandated by Ofcom. This will be followed by a gaining provider-led business switching overview, led by Megan Corcoran and supported by Dave Stubbs on the design and Lee Turner from a wholesaler perspective. And as prompted already, please raise any questions you have in the Q&A area on your Zoom screens at the bottom, stating who your question is for. We will then pick them up and attempt to go through them all during the panel sessions at the end of each of the three main sessions. So thank you for that. And now I hand over to Paul Bradbury.
Thank you very much, Steve. Steve, can you confirm that anybody that needs to can see and hear me?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you, Paul.
Fantastic. Okay. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you to all for inviting me. Delighted to be speaking at this conference. So very happy to talk about One Touch Switch. I'll talk something about the history such as it is, about One Touch Switch, exactly what it is and what TOTSCO's role is and what it isn't indeed in One Touch Switch. Also about the current status. And then before I hand back to Megan, I'll just say a few words about where we are with One Touch Switch and use by business-facing CPs, which I imagine will segue well into the subsequent discussion. Just clarify one thing, Steve. Thank you. You gave me a promotion. You've made me chair of TOTSCO. If it's the case, I'll be asking for a pay rise. But as far as I'm aware, I'm the CEO, reporting to Claudio Pollack, who's the chairman, and of course the board, but I'll talk a little bit about the constitution of TOTSCO as we go along. So yes, my name is Paul Bradbury. I'm CEO at TOTSCO, which is, as I'm sure you know, short for the One Touch Switching Company, and I've been in position since the beginning of August this year. So a little, just to recap a little bit on the history of One Touch Switch. It has its roots in European legislation some time ago. And the introduction of One Touch Switch followed a long period of consultation by Ofcom with the industry which I'm sure many of those here were involved in and probably know more about than me. But there were essentially two options in terms of how this was going to be done, and one touch switch was the chosen option, and it's since been enshrined in the new general conditions which come into force in April next year. Of course, as we also know, one touch switch regulation applies only to residential customers, which is a big number. The number we're operating is in the area of 3 million switches per year. It's a very high volume business. And the aim of one touch switch is to make the market more competitive, to increase the engagement of consumers with the marketplace, which is especially apt at a time when alternative networks and suppliers are increasing and there are new technological ways of entering the marketplace. So that's a little bit about the background. A key stage which has been in development for some time, some months, and which I can't stress enough, and one that I'll return to in the context of business CP use of one touch switch, is process. So what is one touch switch? TOTSCO is not one touch switch, and one touch switch is not TOTSCO. One touch switch is really a process that people have to follow. And the first stage in getting to where we are today, and the most crucial stage, and really the very platform on which everything else is built, is the industry process, which was drafted in through consultation with industry and via a detailed design group, and is now available on the TOTSCO website. And I'm sure that people at this conference are aware of it and have probably read it. Why is that so important? Because one touch switch is, by definition, really, it's a process where people across the industry, actors across the industry, have to coordinate and act in the same way, according to, they have to literally sing from the same hymn sheet, really, in order to give a good, quick, easy and reliable experience to the consumer. Therefore, there has to be an agreed process by which everybody works, and that's what the industry process is. Now, an integral part of that process is the message exchanging hub, but that's all that it is. It's part of the process. But of course, it's an important part, and it's one that I'm deeply interested in, because it's TOTSCO's responsibility, indeed, to do the detailed design, to do the commissioning of that hub via a subcontractor, to bring it into being and to be responsible for its operation for the foreseeable future. And indeed, that's really the purpose behind TOTSCO's incorporation back in June this year. A little bit about TOTSCO. TOTSCO has been charged with the ownership or the guardianship of the industry process and commissioning and running the hub. It's funded by loans from industry, and we're quite open about who the lenders are. That can be found on the website. It's the bigger telecoms companies, but that is an arm's length relationship. The loans are provided on an arm's length basis at a commercial rate of interest, and those loans bring the lenders no particular privilege in terms of using or designing the hub. TOTSCO is a not-for-profit organisation. We won't aim to run anything other than a prudent surplus for operational purposes. And after we've repaid the loan, obviously repaying the loans is something that has to be done, and we'll be adjusting the price levels to make sure that all that can be done and that we don't make a profit. In terms of where are we as a company, and indeed in terms of the process overall for one touch switch, well, some key documents have been published during October, and they are, as I say, available on our website. Those documents are the industry process, to which I've just put in its current version 4.1 with an accompanying diagram. Also, we have published around the same time the API specification and the technical design document. Why is API important? The only way for any CP to access the messaging function of the hub, which is indeed its core function, is via an API. And CPs will either have to build directly APIs from their own systems to the hub, or they will have to commission somebody to do that on their behalf, or they will have to give their data to a third-party integrator who essentially also does it on their behalf. So the API specification is an important part of that, clearly. And taken together, the documents that have been already published, the industry process and the API specification and technical design, that really acts as a starting gun for CPs to start their own development. all the components really are out there, or at least the major building blocks are out there in a sufficiently advanced state for CPs to plan and indeed start designing how they're going to interface with the TOTSCO hub and therefore deliver one-touch switching to their customers. And like I say, the hub is only a small part of this. And when you read the industry process, you look at this, and the vast majority of development work and adaptation that has to be done across the industry does not lie with TOTSCO, it lies with CPs themselves. The next important milestone in terms of TOTSCO, but also in terms of the whole industry, is that we have issued a RFP to certain pre-selected software vendors for the building of the hub. Now, the RFP is not a public document, but what have we actually asked them to do? In the first place, we've asked them to design a hub which is essentially a message exchange, and that's all it is. It's got to be robust, it's got to be resilient, it's got to be extremely available, built to industry leading levels of availability. It's got to be extremely secure. And those things are not easy to achieve. But essentially, its main function is to take a message from one provider and correctly route it and deliver it to another provider, and then to carry the reply if any is required. That, in some ways, is it's an easy to understand task. Of course, it's not entirely easy to deliver, but it's a very straightforward and understandable task. The hub does not alter the message content. It is unaware of the message content. It simply takes a message from one provider and delivers it safely to another. The TOTSCO hub does not store messages. It does not process messages. All these things happen in the CP's own systems. The other thing that is in the RFP, because TOTSCO is a small company, we have asked the vendors that we've gone out to not just to design and build the system, we're also asking them to operate the system, to provide the operational support around it, which includes help desk and other support facilities. It includes the billing, it even includes cash collection, and it includes a major piece of work, which is going to be around leading the testing and onboarding process for all the users of the hub. So that's where we are. That's to concentrate on one touch switch from TOTSCO's point of view. But like I say, to concentrate on TOTSCO is in many ways the wrong area to look, because most of the work lies with industry, who have to adapt their systems, your systems. They have to design processes. They have to train staff. So to put it in stark terms, TOTSCO is not delivering one touch switch. Industry is delivering one touch switch, and industry is accountable to the regulator for delivering one touch switch. And of course, individual CPs are accountable to the regulator for conformity with the general conditions. In terms of timescales, I think we all know that the general conditions take effect in April next year. TOTSCO, from our perspective, we have written to Ofcom an open letter some time ago to say that we think it's extremely unlikely from our point of view that industry will be fully ready by that date. To be clear, Ofcom has not accepted any delay, and it's not TOTSCO's place to say what happens in terms of the attitude that Ofcom will take. I think it's fair to say, though, that Ofcom over time will be applying more and more pressure to industry and all those involved to deliver one touch switch sooner rather than later. So if we look forward to implementation, what are the timelines? What happens next? Well, from TOTSCO's point of view, I suppose we're looking at a nice linear project plan. We've got the RFP out, and we're expecting replies on Monday as it happens. We've got to go through a selection process, and then we have to negotiate a contract with the vendor. Then the vendor has to build the system, and they have to QA the system and put it into a test environment, or even a live environment where people can go and look at it. There needs to be a period of testing after the system is in the environment for industry end-to-end testing before one touch switch goes live. So that's very easy from the TOTSCO point of view. But I think from your point of view, from the CP point of view, you should look at things differently. As I've said, given the documents that are now being released into the public domain, or at least into the industry, industry is now in a position to do the bulk of design work, and even to start building, and even to start designing their test program. Testing, Totsco will do all it can to facilitate testing at every stage of the process. And one of the things that we will be asking the software vendors do, for example, will be to build a test harness in advance of releasing a QA'd version of the hub out into the wild. But that won't be until into next year. People should not think, CP should not think that no testing can be done until then. I think this was something, I don't know how many people were present on the stakeholder forum yesterday, something that was discussed quite vigorously. I would like to challenge people to start thinking about how they test. People can test against themselves, for example. You can build your own test harnesses, test against yourselves. You could even buddy up with partners and test against them. At the end of the day, all the hub will be doing is delivering messages reliably from one party to another, not inspecting the content of those messages. And that's something you can quite easily simulate via other means. So please get inventive. Please don't think that Totsco brings all the answers, although of course we will do whatever we can. You can be designing, building and testing before the hub, before anybody even lays the first brick, before lays the first foundations for the hub. Those things need not happen in sequence. They can and they should happen in parallel. So that's where we are. In terms of timescale, as I've already announced to the industry, and I will repeat, until we have received the RFP responses, which is next Monday, and had time to digest them and clarify them, we won't be in a position to say anything more about the timetable for the availability of the hub. But in some respects, you shouldn't be thinking about that. I think the starting gun has been fired. That April deadline is still the April deadline, or it's still the GC validity date. And you should be thinking about what you can do on your own as soon as possible. Of course, there are still some open questions. I'll just list 3 of those questions. One of them is access to the hub messaging functions for people who feel unable for whatever reason, or really cannot build a direct API link. And now we're talking about managed access solutions. Now, of course, everyone has a different technology stack at different levels of sophistication. And I think when they're highly sophisticated and built in-house, I imagine the in-house teams will be building APIs direct to the Totsco hub. Where people are using off-the-shelf OSS, BSS systems, I think there should be conversations going on between CPs and those providers of OSS systems, BSS systems, for those providers of OSS, BSS systems to build their own API links and doing the job for the CPs. There are third-party integrators in there, and there are wholesalers out there, all of whom may be providing access services to CPs. And those are conversations that should be going on now. Totsco can try and appraise itself of what conversations are going on, but really, I think the onus is on CPs to have those conversations themselves. If there is, what we are consulting on at the moment is whether there's a residual need to provide perhaps a basic service for at least access to the messaging function and possibly more. That's something we're consulting on at the moment. I think it's in everybody's interests that that everybody at least has access to the access to the messaging functions of the hub. And that is something that Totsco will endeavour to make sure happens by go live date. Whether Totsco actually writes and releases its own product for that purpose, or whether it acts more as midwife than as parent to ensure that such a solution is available, we remain interested and we'll do everything we can to make sure that happens. The second open question is rather a detailed one about the process. You will know that if you've read, well, you will know from your reading that the first step in the one-touch switch process is a matching request that is sent via the hub from the gaining provider to the losing provider to say, please confirm that this customer is indeed yours and that they are providing the services that we are being asked to take over, we're being asked to switch. And there is an SLA around that Ofcom has put in place, which is that switch match request should be answered within 60 seconds. At the same time, that match request should trigger the provision of switching implications sent directly from the losing provider to the customer. Now, for One Touch Switch to be a truly customer-friendly experience, and for it to be truly one touch, in other words, not to require multiple visits and contacts with the gaming provider, we expect, and Ofcom in fact does expect, that switching information is generated simultaneously and sent instantly to the customer. However, that is something that is not currently stated in the SLAs within version 4.1 of the industry process, and it's something that we will be we have kicked off a consultation and a questionnaire on, because we're keen to hear the views of industry about the desirability and the feasibility of doing just that. And the third open question, which I think is particularly relevant for the current audience and segues into the next section, is the extent to which One Touch Switch, or perhaps the TOTSCO hub, will be used in for business-facing CPs. And if I can just say a few words on that before I hand over to you, Megan. We know that One Touch Switch, when we read the general conditions, One Touch Switch does not apply to CPs providing switching services to business customers. One Touch Switch is a residential process. However, gaming provider led does, and indeed there may be an overlap. Just to say a couple of things about business from TOTSCO's perspective. There is, of course, the division between simple business and complex business. With any distinction, there are always grey areas, but I think we would all agree that there is there are some business users who if I can put it this way, they are residential adjacent. They look a little bit like residential customers with the same simplicity, the same product palette. Whereas complex business is exactly what it says on the tin. It's complex, it's multi-site, there's a different product palette. Also, there are different numbers. The CP landscape looks extremely different, which is quite relevant to TOTSCO and to the hub, between business and residential CPs. There are a relatively small number of residential CPs processing a relatively large number of switches, and the inverse is true for the business community. There's a relatively large number of communications providers engaged in a comparatively small number of switches per year. So in terms of TOTSCO's direct interest, I suppose, we are thinking, well, in our dialogue with business, there's an obvious question around, can business switches share some or indeed all of the process, and critically the hub? And the questions we're asking ourselves are, yes, but for what exactly? And then how would that be achieved? How does the rest of the process then occur? And the question about whether, if the hub is made available for all users, whether everyone will use it, and whether that can become an obligation on the business-facing CPs. So in terms of the current status, the industry, on behalf of small business, is looking at how the current industry process would have to be adapted for the needs of simple business switching, what modifications to the hub that may require. And that's for residential adjacent customers. Of course, there's no guarantee that can be done. We've actually launched the RFP with a particular specification, which is consistent with version 4.1 of the industry process, which is for residential customers only. But if, in theory, the needs could be satisfied with very small or preferably no modifications, of course, that's something we should look at. The current status around complex businesses is more complicated because, of course, the needs are more varied. Is it even possible to map an industry process? And right at the beginning of my talk, I was saying that the process, the documented and thorough process, underlies all of this. And is it indeed possible to look at adaptations to the hub without understanding without a clearly documented process for complex business? So that's something we're currently talking to business about. So in a second, I'll hand over to Megan. Just to summarise, look, I was delighted to be invited today to update you on the status of One Touch switching and to where TOTSCO is, and indeed who we are, where we are, how far we've got, but really just to kind of repeat the message. TOTSCO is not one-touch switching. One-touch switching is not TOTSCO. One-touch switching is for the industry to deliver. I'm delighted, though, to be involved in a vital part of that, and I look forward to working with all of you to deliver one-touch switching and indeed gaining provider-led switching. Megan, over to you now, please.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for coming along and telling us about the progress at TOTSCO. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Leona. I was just going to say, can I have my slides? Can I have the first slide, please? So good afternoon. I'm Megan Corcoran. I co-chair the Gaining Provider-Led Business Steering Group alongside Jack Abbots of the OTA. I'm also head of industry liaison for FCS. So we've heard from Paul Bradbury on the latest from TOTSCO, and the OTS is mandated for the residential market. So I will be focusing on business switching and talking to you about the Gaining Provider-Led Business Steering Group. Can I have the next slide, please? So who's the steering group? It's a very collaborative and voluntary group comprising of a range of stakeholders, including wholesalers, aggregators, network resellers, trade associations, and direct CPs. We're set up to design, implement, and embed industry processes to support complex and business switching. The only known group across industry working on a solution for all business switching outside TOTSCO at the moment. Have the next slide, please. So what is our purpose? Our purpose is to create a process that will support business customers to switch providers regardless of size and service complexity. We know the business market is more complex, and we know there's all sorts of providers, and we want to make sure we have a process that works for everybody. It needs to be robust and maintain customer confidence in industry. We certainly don't want to damage the very good flourishing market we've got. It needs to work with interfaces and other switching processes, such as number porting. We need to provide a defined way of working with clear roles and responsibilities. And then afterwards, we'll be dealing with post-implementation with impartial guidance to all parties, a bit like it works in number porting today. Have the next slide, please. So what and who is in scope? So Ofcom defined those suppliers of the following services are in scope. So MBICS, so that is any number-based voice service that's not a mobile, and internet access services provided at a fixed location. So broadband, for example. All providers of the above services are in scope. Have the next slide. So why do we need to change? Following Ofcom consultation in 2019, there are new general conditions that have been introduced on the 3rd of April. Now, switching isn't the only part of that regulation. It's part of the European Electronics Communications Code. But I'm focusing on switching today. For FCS members, we have a document on our website that tells you about the changes and how you can implement them. So the new regulations on switching are targeted at the rights of the end customers. And the new requirements state that business and residential customers can switch their voice and broadband service using a process led by the gaining provider, regardless of network or technology their existing provider uses. So that is quite different to what we have today. The gaining provider bit is a very important bit. The new rules will apply to internet access service and number-based intercommunication services, as I've just said. So if you provide voice and you provide internet access, then this applies to you. As Paul's touched on, providers of consumers are mandated to use the OTS process. Providers to business customers are mandated to use a gaining provider-led process. It's not so prescriptive for business. Can we have the next slide, please? So key changes must be gaining provider-led switching. So this means the interaction is between the gaining retail and losing retail CP or their appointed representative. So new switching rules apply both within and between infrastructure or voice network providers. Ofcom are removing the existing rules relating to notification of transfer. That includes cancel other and calling off periods. So you'll still get your messaging from Openreach if it's the Openreach network that you're talking about switching on. but you won't be able to cancel other, except for certain scenarios, I think working line takeover, for example. Ofcom haven't defined the mechanism for switching for business, but CPs have worked together to develop a process, and that is what we're doing. So as an industry, we do need to define how the new switching rules will interact and work alongside existing processes. This is quite a big change, I think, for a lot of smaller providers, that the regulatory obligation falls upon the retailer. That's the company that contracts with the end customer. So wholesalers are not responsible for switching. You can delegate authority for porting, for example, which is part of a switch, but it's important to note that the regulatory obligation is on the retailer. So that's the person contracting to the end customer. Can we have the next slide, please? So what have we achieved to date? Early this year, the OTA started off a group of interested parties to design and develop a process for business customers. The group began scoping the requirements and looking at possible process solutions. Jack from the OTA chaired, and in August, the group appointed me to co-chair. This group has spent thousands, and I can definitely guarantee thousands, maybe more, of hours scoping possible business process solutions, looking at all switching scenarios in the business market and working out how switching can work in the complex supply chain and inter-supplier network. We've also examined the move from residential to business and vice versa. This is a challenge, as Openreach and other wholesalers cannot differentiate between business and residential customers. And this we talk about in our key learning. So one of the big things is the NOT plus and equivalent processes. They really need to work for the industry as a whole. To remove it for one part of the industry and not another would be challenging. So that's something that we've been looking at. We have developed our business switching principles, which we are presenting to Ofcom next week. We've set up a process and technology subgroup, and we have a high-level process. And Dave Stubbs will be talking about that in a minute for you. So, and the last sort of piece of learning is about we need a secure and auditable messaging system. It's vital, I think, for the CPs to be able to talk to one another in the switching process. We think that is a key thing. Can I have the next slide, please? So whilst the solution is being prepared, there is some things you as CPs can do in readiness. So point of sale journeys, how do you capture consent, understand what extra information you may need during your sales journeys? There's quite a lot of work to do around that. Ensure contracts and notice periods are in line with the new gaming provider-led regulation. Bear in mind, you may need to accept notice from the gaming provider if you're the losing CP. So it's quite a lot of work to do around your contracts there. Understanding right to port and ensure processes allow for this. Understanding the rules around compensation. That's one of the EEC rules coming out. And there's other changes such as Openreach contact engine, and that might affect your compensation because it's giving the customer the opportunity to move the appointment out. So you'll need to understand that and also have a very satisfactory audit trail. Also, CPs will need to think about slamming in the absence of cancel other. This is not just for a losing provider, but for a gaining provider too. So CPs have still got a lot of work to do in that area. Have the next slide. So what is the next steps of the group? So we need a contact directory for the retail business community contacts. That is quite a big challenge, getting everybody together to do that. We're creating a program plan to publish and manage a switching principles document, to publish and manage best practice guide and FAQs, which we'll produce for industry. Review the proposed process for the whole of the business community. So obviously we're having a high level presentation today, but we need to go out to the whole of the industry and get the feedback back from industry to make sure that we're on the right train and it's working, and then any feedback needs to be taken back in. We're also going to be hosting the documentation probably on the FCS website with a secure closed user group. And obviously to agree the process and technology required to deliver the industry solution. Next slide, please. So if you've got any questions, please, I can see some popping up. Please put them in the question and answer box, and we'll answer them at the end. But now to talk a bit more about the process is Dave Stubbs. So over to you, Dave.
Let's wait for my video to kick in. There we go. Hello. Yeah, Dave Stubbs. My role in switching up to this point, I've been involved since 2019. And I'm part of that DDG, Detailed Design Group, that's defined the one-touch switching process and also put together the design docs that are all sitting on Totsco with a couple of other individuals that hopefully you've all been reading to understand how the hub works. As we move forward from the consumer processes, we're now looking at obviously what that means for businesses, Megan has alluded to. If we just go forward a slide or two. There we go. So these next couple of slides are just recapping what we've said before, so this deck can stand on its own if anyone picks up afterwards. So as we've already said, that Ofcom's mandated that retailers must apply the one-touch switch process that industry has already defined for consumers, but also a GPL process for business. Now, retailers and a gaming provider are not necessarily the same thing in the business world, so that's our first challenge to understand in our flows that we're working with. And also the question that Ofcom have clarified that everybody must implement a losing journey capability in switching, but nobody is mandated to provide a gaming provider journey. So we will define all the processes. Businesses are free to provide the gaming journey if they so wish. Most should do, because obviously it's in their best interests to gain switching customers, but everybody must implement the losing journey. If you just jump forward quickly, next. Some working assumptions, I think Megan has mentioned some of these. Providers continue to port numbers using their existing process to meet their Ofcom regular obligations. And this is a process that's got to support all providers and customers of all sizes. So we started out looking at business as two separate journeys, what it meant for smaller businesses looking to switch and larger. And through our consultation, through our work as a community, we realised that actually it made sense to bring them back together and to actually have a single unified process that supported something a little quicker, where it supported the smaller businesses, and something that was a bit more drawn out and more involved to support the larger part of the businesses. I'll draw that out a bit more as we go through. So next slide, please. So as Paul has already alluded to, Totsco is providing the technical mechanism. Right now it also owns, or it's carrying the responsibility to support getting industry to deliver the one-touch switch process. But I think, as Paul mentioned, it doesn't actually own the one-touch switch process. Business owns that. Now, the difference of where we are at the moment, that we formed this business group that's looking at the business process in detail, and we're trying to cover all aspects of the business community. The consumer side has put itself to one side to let Totsco deliver it at the moment, but an equivalent of the business group will need to come back together to re-own that process for consumer going forward. And that allows the industry to define any changes it wants to make to the process. And then it will be up to engagements with Totsco if that change to process would impact in any way on the hub solution. And that's very much where we are in our minds as well with the business process as we look through the upcoming slides, that the hub is there just to deliver messages. There's nothing technically in there specific to a one-touch switch process. In fact, I've been consulting with the NICC and discussing the hub with them for over a year, looking at future needs of other activities around central numbering databases for the telecoms industry, and a hub solution being a means for communicating those. So the design that's gone into the Totsco hub has been very much in mind to support multiple processes going forward, and to be completely agnostic of specifically one touch switch itself. So that's a key design paradigm, and we'll dwell on that a little bit more as we go through the slides. Come next slide, please. Probably just a caption slide. Yeah. So if you jump forward one more, and we'll have a look a little bit at the details. So where we started from. So those of you that have looked on the Totsko website will have found some rather horrendous giant spreadsheets called the industry process flows. We're working on that principle at the moment for business, where we're mapping out all of the interactions that we feel that we need between all the participants in a business process. That's the interaction between the gaming provider and their customer, the gaming provider to the losing provider, and the losing provider to other parties in the supply chain. Now, the gaming customer, the first part that we've been working on recently is to understand the permission element of that process. And we're talking about using the existing letter of authority mechanisms that we have in business to provide the rights for a customer to represent themselves in a switch. And because that customer is not talking to the losing provider, then not necessarily have that direct representation or access to systems that they might do in terms of turning off their existing service. So one of the first things we're doing is looking at a mechanism of digitally being able to capture the customer's letter of intent or letter of authority or intent in whatever means that might be to present to the losing provider such that they can recognize that and agree on a switch based on that party representing themselves. Now, at the moment, when I'm talking through this and the process, I'm not specifically saying this is going to be done using the messaging process on the Totsko Hub, and I'll come to that in a little more detail. So what we're doing specifically is separating the process itself from the technology at this point. So when we're talking about these interactions, we're not assuming the messages will go through the hub. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So having captured letters of authority, the next stage is to understand the services the customer wants to switch. And we recognize that although bells lines and anything that's a number-based service that's looking to switch is relatively straightforward, you can just provide the telephone number that you want to switch that service to your gaming provider. But the industry has no common nomenclature for their IAS services, broadbands, or other services that you're delivering your internet access over. So that we need a mechanism by which customers can obtain from their losing provider a list, we're calling them assets, a list of those services that those losing provider, and you may be switching from multiple losing providers in a switch scenario. So a means for the gaming provider to request on behalf of the customer that the losing provider supply the customer. And it's important it goes to the customer and not go back to the gaming provider, because that information may divulge more sensitive and commercial information to the gaming provider. So it goes to the customer. A list of the services that are being provided with some identifier such that the customer can then provide that back to the gaming provider to say, I want to switch service X at site Y, for example. So those are the first two key steps in a journey. Who am I? Am I authorized to do this? And these are the things that I want to switch. We need to get a clear relationship going between the customer and the losing provider through the gaming provider. That's the key part of this journey, and that's where most of the complication lies, just getting that part of the journey right, to keep it simple, and get that customer onboarded into the process. Once the losing provider has confirmed that they have those services and that they are authorized to actually cease them and switch them, and obviously there are contractual issues potentially within the industry looking at those contracts, those services. You may be entitled to cease them, but you may be still required contractually to pay for them for a period of time. That would be expected that the losing provider would communicate that back to the customer through implications of switching or some other means to inform them of what that issue is. If you skip on the next slide, please. Now, having gone through that step of communicating what you want to switch, being notified of the implications, deciding you want to go ahead with it, then the next stage is to agree when you want to switch, whether as a customer you're happy to switch both services on the same day, provide the new service and turn off the old service, whether you'd like an element of parallel running where the technology allows. If you're not taking over a line, for example, then you're switching from one provider on one network to another provider on another network. You may wish to have a parallel running for a period of time. Now we'll support that within switching for an amount of time to be determined yet. 30 days is reasonable. A year isn't reasonable. It does not a switch if you're running parallel for a year. You're running a provide and a subsequent cease. So we've yet to determine what that central ground is, but there will be a limit by which we make that determination. At an appropriate time, when that switch time is agreed, the losing provider would then notify, the gaining provider, would then notify the losing provider of their intent to, or their requirement to turn off that service now. They may have been, their service may have been up and running, the customers indicated they're now happy, and the losing provider will be instructed to turn it off. The losing provider will, in part of the matching journey and the previous comms, indicate if there is a lead time to cease. So it may be that through the supply chain, a request to cease takes 5 days. That will be part of the communication as well, the ability to notify if there's if it's not going to drop dead on the date that you specify. From point of notification, it will take 5 days. And so the agreed time will be set on whatever the provider needs to switch it off with that in mind. And once the gaining providers finished their engagement with that losing provider and the customer's happy that all their services are switched, then the gaining provider would send a confirmation that that process is complete to the losing provider. If you go on to the next slide, please. Okay, and one more. So obviously in all this, what we're talking by gaining and losing provider, we're primarily looking at retailers. They're the point of engagement. The name on the bill is what it's all about when it comes to switching. Who is my current provider? The only way that I as a customer know is because I've got a bill with a name on it. And as a gaining provider, that engagement has to be with that named body on the bill. Now, it doesn't mean that behind that named body there is not a supply chain, because invariably there is. But that named provider is the person that's responsible for delivering that switching experience. Now, what we're looking at the moment, and one of the next levels down in our design, is to work out what the support the supply chains can give to the process in terms of making available information on those assets that we talked about, for example, any associated services that may be lost. It may be that the retailer doesn't know much about the services at all, but they should be still responsible for delivering that information to the customer. It's just a matter of what support do we need from the supply chain, and I'm sure we'll get some more information from that on Lee following me in a moment. Should we skip on the next slide? Now, so back to the question in hand. So we're working on the process, and we now need to work out how we're best going to deliver that process and how we're going to provide a means for industry to comply with it. So as Megan already stated, we need a structured mechanism capable of being used by all switching participants and customers, regardless of size or role. So we're not creating any processes to leave anyone behind. Must be repeatable, simple interactions, and clearly defined behaviours and outcomes. If I put in a request to get a letter of intent, I'm expecting a response to say, yes, I recognise the customer and I've sent them that letter of intent, and I've recognised that letter of intent. If I want an asset list, that yes, I've got that request and I've sent it to the customer. Simple, basic interactions. The switching process, and if you read the switching documents, although there's a lot of complexity in what you implement, specifically as a losing provider, the actual steps of interaction on one touch switch are very simple. I do a match. I send a request to the losing provider to get a match for my services. They respond to say yes or no that I've got them. I say, okay, fine, the customer wants to go forward with a switch. I'll let you know when it's time to switch. And then at the time of switch, I say, right, switch now. So very simple set of interactions. There's nothing complicated happening in between, because the gaining provider and the losing provider don't really need to know much about the relationship of the services between themselves. They're just passing on that role to the losing provider. Trying to achieve the same thing with business. A few simple steps that are repeatable, that everyone understands. When I do this, I expect that to happen, and if it doesn't happen, then I expect something else to happen instead. So if we skip on, next slide, please. So how can we integrate the process? So we're looking at a number of options. So the first and most obvious one is we have a Topsco hub that is providing a messaging capability, and as I've already stated, the process was designed to be agnostic of the hub. The hub is a means for delivering the messages that the process supports. And business is taking exactly the same principle. There is nothing in the process design that requires any changes to the Topsco hub. This is a conversation obviously we need to have with Topsco still, but that's the intent, that there is a single unified mechanism for delivering messages for industry, which is the hub, and the processes, whatever they be, whether it be one touch switch now, a business switch tomorrow, let's say number porting in a couple of years' time could use the hub, for example. They're all designed to be completely agnostic and to not impact the hub other than volumes of transactions, clearly. The next level down from hub, direct hub integration, which obviously suits those providers that are very well technically integrated and capable of doing direct hub integration, would be if we provided up some sort of portal. And there are a couple of ways of looking at what portal might look like. It could be a completely standalone environment that providers that make use of that portal can communicate with each other and raise switching requests, publish them to each other. Or one of the models that we'll look on a subsequent slide is where that portal is also integrated to the hub. So those that are directly integrated in the hub can talk to those that are using a portal and be completely hidden for the fact that one provider is using one mechanism and the other provider is using the other. Manual and direct switching. One of the key things, and I think there's a subsequent slide on this, is that we need to know who all of our retail providers are and how to talk to them. So central to that is the directory. Now, the Topsco hub has a directory. It's designed to facilitate all the information that we need for any provider switching, be that consumer, be that business. So again, that's a conversation with Topsco to see if that directory can serve our purposes as well. Given that many business providers will also be providing a level, however small, of a consumer function, that there's a train of thought that there'll be a significant number of providers in the directory already. If we had to stand up a secondary directory, then we could make that available through some other means if necessary. But that facilitates potentially a process where those providers that absolutely can't integrate can use mechanisms such as sending email with an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, it's the bad old days of number porting and NPAR files and the like, but it works. However clunky that might be, but it's a lowest common denominator. It's a mechanism that everyone can follow. Everyone has access to email. There is a way even of integrating emails into the Topsco hub through gateway functions that can interpret emails and convert them into messages to the hub and vice versa. So we're looking at all those options. And if you just go forward a slide, I think the next one is talking, just shows the thinking basically, is that the hub is the core mechanism for one touch switch and for the Topsco process, where both parties are expected to be directly integrated. So that's party one and party two in the diagram above. And a business model, if we get to that point, then party one and two might be business customers. But party 3 and 4 just don't have the technical capability to integrate directly with the hub. They could be using a TPI, a portal, an email gateway to talk directly to each other. And those gateways could, if we've got access to the hub, then pass those messages to facilitate communications to party 1 and party 2. So we're trying to facilitate an ecosystem that avoids us having to have 15 different mechanisms and you have to work out what provider supports what mechanism. We're trying to bring everyone along, find a solution that will suit every size of provider and their customer, and a technology that can support every provider equally, however they're integrated. Just go through one more. I think that's the directory. So just a little bit more on the directory. The plan of the Tosco directory is that it's a downloadable entity. So although the actual directory is hosted on the hub, the intent is that it's published and you download a copy of it on a daily, weekly basis, whatever's necessary. I mean, the industry doesn't change that rapidly. But as providers set up new means of communication, change the way that you do switching with them, then that information will be updated. And that document would be published and available to resellers themselves to do direct integration, to give to TPIs, and that gives them the means to provide that communication channel. And that directory contains all sorts of things from the API integration and security information, which obviously isn't published out to individuals, to email contacts, phone numbers, even help pages, so that if you are offering a switching process and as part of that you need to provide your account number, but you can't work out where your account number is on your bill, or you can't tell the difference between zeros and O's, that if you've got a help page that you can provide to your customers to understand how they should be engaging with the switching process and understand your information, the losing provider can direct you via web pages or just providing you the link if necessary, so that you can actually find that information. So it's a central data exchange, and that's downloadable for everyone to load. One of the key things in the directory is it's mastered on, at the moment, RCPID, the retail CPID, which isn't quite the same as RID that some of you will be familiar with. And we recognise that the RID list is not fully inclusive of all parties that will be needing for switching. But the directory is going to facilitate RCPID lists. And as I said, the design is there to support QPID lists, RID lists, so that we can support other processes as we need to with different parties in the post office. When I use the word post office, I haven't talked about the hub in those terms, but we're effectively following a postal mechanism for the hub, where a party can just post a message to a destination provider and say, okay, I want to send this message to RCPID VMB for Virgin Media Business, for example, and the hub knows how to deliver it. But it could just as well say QPID 123. We jump forward. I think we might be near the end of my things. Right, so the iceberg. So we want this process to be as simple as possible on the surface. So the customer does next to nothing. They provide their letter of authority, and if necessary, they're presented with a list of the assets they want to switch, and they select them. So from their perspective, an extremely simple process. A gaining CP is responsible, gets a bit more involved. Obviously, they've got to capture that customer's intent and have the communication with the losing provider. But the gaining provider role is, again, relatively simple. They're literally just capturing those information and those trigger points. Time to switch now. I've raised an order. We're going ahead with the switch and communicate those with the losing provider. It's the losing provider that's got all the complicated jobs. They've got to go away, find all their assets from their supply chain, pull them all together, put them in a letter, write their implications of switching, what that means to their contracts and their terms, and then ultimately they've got to turn off all their services. Portal is obviously something that is going to need to be slick, good user experience for non-integrated retailers. So there's a lot of complexity in delivering that solution if we get there. And obviously an email gateway that I talked about as well. some level of complexity there. So all those things, as we go deeper into the stack, they get a bit more complicated, but we hide all the complication from the customer. And next slide. So we're ongoing meetings with Ofcom. Well, I think Megan mentioned it, but we've got best practices guide that we're working on, and we'll be taking Ofcom through that. The solution is taking shape. We're working on those process flows over the next couple of weeks to hopefully get to an outline messaging design, and working with Totsko to see if we can facilitate that with the hub. But we're also looking at all of the different mechanisms. What I didn't say about those mechanisms, one of the key things obviously is we're looking at the costs of all these things. It's no good us going away and saying we'll design a portal and it's going to cost X million pounds and that's got to be funded by those in business. That means you have to pay £500 a transaction, because that's just not going to fly for anyone. So we're not going to build a solution just because it looks technically good. It has to be affordable to everyone as well. So it may be that the slickest process is also the most costly one, and that steers us away from it. So those things are all factors that we need to weigh, and therefore nobody's left behind. Though identifying everyone is still a challenge in industry. Next, I think that's probably my last slide. Thank you. I'll pass the ball to Lee. And answer questions after, if you drop them in comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, my name's Lee Turner. I head up the Regulatory Affairs and Industry Engagement at Gamma. We have quite a large wholesale presence in the market, as well as direct presence. Those of you who know me won't be surprised now I'm going to go off at a bit of a tangent for the first part of this presentation. We will get into the role of the wholesale CP in switching in the second part. But the first part, I'm going to have a look at how the market's changing, because the way that you consume, design, develop and sell products is going to change in the next few years. I mean, in business, it already has to a large extent, but that will impact how you can switch customers, where you buy your products from. And that offers its own sort of challenges as well as opportunities. So if we can go to the first slide, please. So the changing market, we're moving away from traditional telecoms products. And the first thing we have to do is break the legacy thinking. You know, the fixed phone line broadband model's going, and we have to stop thinking in legacy terms when we're designing systems and processes. It's extremely frustrating when you sit in meetings and people still talk about FTTC and WLAW and these type of products when they're talking about designing products and processes for the future. They're defunct, they're gone. You know, and it's been a constant fight with industry and also the regulator. You know, the first Ofcom switching statement referred to voice products, you know, fixed location voice products as being switchable. Again, no recognition of how IP voice works in the real world. And it took a challenge from a few players to get them to see the light and change their mind. You're also starting, you also see it as well in the commercial side of it as well. People still bundling together voice and broadband. They sell voice and broadband together. You want to move it, you got to move your voice and broadband together, and commercially they tie them together. It's very short-sighted, because the way the market's splitting, the two are completely separate products. And the way that you decide to go in the market, you may want to concentrate on just that one sector. You know, and when we look at it, software, yeah, it'll be as important as connectivity. We'll get into that probably a little bit more when we're looking at the competition. Yeah, the frustrating part really is that the business market is way more advanced today in the use of IP voice. Some of us have been selling services for 12 years, but we rarely get called on to share that experience with either the regulator or CPs adopting new technology. And the formation of the business steering group, I hope, will enable a one-touch point for Ofcom and for other providers to come to actually learn from our experience. When we look at software, I mean, the link in between the physical service and the number will be broken apart. What you're going to have is an application layer which might support, amongst other things, voice calls. And that's where we've also got to break this legacy thinking, you know, because what this offers, it's huge flexibility, you know, in the way we develop, sell, and ultimately switch telecoms, you know, and it can offer even retention type products. You know, we can differentiate services through software innovation, which means that you could lose the access service, but keep the voice application. So again, we've got to get away from this legacy point. However, it does introduce some complexity when we look at switching, because you're not just switching a service, a voice service. In effect, you're switching a number going forward, and you will still have an application that may be retained in contract with the customer. Supply chains. Well, if you're buying from Openreach today and you're buying WLR, broadband, whatever, but specifically WLR and ISDN, if you're not building out to exchanges and you're not going to exchange presence yourself, you'll be consuming via the wholesale market. You know, the products, yeah, not consumable. WLR as well is a managed product. Openreach carry out the porting, they carry out the migration, they control the journey for you. Going forward, you're going to have to manage that yourself, along with your wholesale partner. And then what also is, it introduces quite a bit of complexity in your supply chain, is multiple wholesalers may be involved in a single end user contract. So a retailer may look at a really good voice app that's got integration, it's got everything else. That supplier doesn't want to sell broadband, that wholesale provider. So you're going to have to go to someone else to buy your broadband services, which means that when you come to a switch, you're going to have to juggle those two balls to get the switch enabled. Competition. Your competitor tomorrow will not necessarily be your competitor today. A lot of the new entrants that are coming into the market, particularly in the voice arena, they're not traditional telecoms providers. They're not bound by the legacy thinking and design, and in some cases not even bound by regulation, because they farm the number inside out to someone else to do. And again, you've got to stop thinking of legacy products, legacy functionality, because your competition doesn't have that history, and they're going to develop solutions that use rapid design methodologies and going to evolve quickly. I think we saw that during COVID. You know, 3 years ago, how many people were using Teams, Zoom, products from 8x8? They had to up the game, and they did it quite quickly. Yeah, and also, I think one of the problems we do see is we're fighting all the time for recognition of that complex supply chain. As you enter that complex supply chain market, you'll see that a lot of the industry processes, a lot of the network processes, a lot of the regulatory processes are designed with a vertically integrated provider in mind. They assume that everybody signs a contract with the end user, from network to the end user. They have full control of it. It doesn't work in the complex supply chain. Next slide, please. So, to paraphrase Monty Python, you know, what have wholesalers ever done for us? Well, this is, what are you going to do for me? And it's a question we get asked all the time as a wholesale provider. Whenever new regulation comes out, our customers say, what are you doing to help us? You know, what support are you going to give us? Are you going to give us portals? Are you going to give us interfaces? So first thing is, who's responsible for what? Well, it's your responsibility to meet regulation. It's not ours. So if there's a fine, if there are sanctions, it falls on the retail provider. However, that's not to say that we're not cognizant of the fact that we're there to help you. The wholesaler, though, has a restricted view of your customer details. That's a view as a wholesaler. You'll see it in number portability. You'll see it in all sorts of switching. You retain your customer information. So we can't do particular validation on your behalf. That's up to you. And if you look at the way the model's designed, you have to validate A, that you've got the customer, B, what the assets are. We can't do any of that unless, and I'm putting unless there, some of the solutions we're looking at are proxies and uploading assets to databases, etc. For number portability, though, you might have seen that I think it was a couple of years ago when Ofcom introduced some regulation, they did roll up some of the responsibility on the supply chain to meet and support regulation. And that sort of recognizes that for the majority of providers outside of the big 5 or 6 resi providers, you don't do your own porting, you rely on a porting agent. So when we're looking at switching, we have to work out how do we integrate that. Brings me on to another point. As a retailer, it's up to you to choose your market as well. And if you decide to go voice only, you could argue that today the existing number porting process meets GPL regulation. It matches, it does asset validation, and it's got explicit authority built into it. Needs a bit of tweaking, but that's your choice as a retailer. Coming to the role of the wholesaler, we have to keep you informed. And so when you look at the GPL switching process, what it does require is really good communication up and down the supply chain. You've got the gaining provider, losing provider talking to each other, but also in the wholesale side, the players within that chain have to talk to each other. We have to keep you updated with what's happening with the orders. You have to do the same as well with any changes so that the journey's matched up across the gaining and losing provider. The other thing is we've got to provide a commercial framework to allow regulatory requirements to be met. It's no good tying you down to 12-month termination of contracts. It's no good tying you down to certain contractual demands that regulation forces you that you can't impose on your end customer. So that's the discussion when you're looking at wholesale products. Have a serious conversation with your prospective wholesaler about those contractual requirements, because certainly Outreach have made some changes to WLR, as you know, to meet some of the switching rules. Other wholesalers are going to have to do the same thing. You do have a challenge on a split supply chain, because how do you make sure that if you've got 2 suppliers and one supplying broadband, one supplying voice, that you've got same contractual terms? Because you could you're going to bundle those together, sell them to an end user with one contractual term. So it's something, again, you have to think about when you're going to a split supplier arrangement. We can only control as wholesalers the products that we supply. Again, as I said, we've got to manage the other players in the supply chain. We do that today on number portability. It's difficult sometimes, but we do manage to do it. I think the most important point, though, is representing our customers with the regulator, the industry and supplier engagement. The one thing about the wholesale market, once you move to it, you've got the advantage of bulk buying power. That gives us a chance to negotiate with our suppliers. Where we do struggle today is getting the regulator to take notice of business. It's been a problem, and also a recognition of the supply chain, but that's our job. That's what you're paying us for, and we will represent you. You won't have the resource to do that yourself. I mean, if we just look at switching, I think we've put several thousand hours in the past 3 or 4 months into looking at business and switching. As I said, challenges for switching in the complex supply chain, multiple suppliers per switch. You're going to have to juggle those, because the switching system, OTS, whatever we put in place, it doesn't enact the switch. It allows you to meet your obligations in terms of communication, in terms of the gaining provider driving the journey. You still have to use your BAU provisioning systems, your C systems, your number porting systems in order to facilitate the switch. And once you're managing multiple suppliers, it becomes really complex. Porting, well, in effect, porting is becoming a switching process. So today we have number porting is gaining provider led, but what we do have, we're restricted in accessibility to switching systems and user information. In effect, your number port now for a voice service becomes a switch. It's cross-network, it's cross-platform. What we don't have is any way of interrogating the information that you may be using within OTS. So OTS will give a switching reference. We'll receive a port order with a switching reference through. How do we know it's valid? To date, the design doesn't allow us to interrogate that database to find out if it's a valid, well, there is no database, to ensure it is a valid switch request. So the danger is we may have to take switching requests at face value. If we get a switch through and it's got a one-touch switch reference, do we just process it? Because the other thing to remember, cancel other is going. Cancel other is going both from number porting and from your provisional services. So even if we inform you of the switch, you can't cancel that switch. So again, further discussions in the industry as to what our role is. And if you can provide us with more information, or willing to provide us with more information in order to enact that switch on your behalf. The other one is wholesalers. Well, we might have to become switching proxies. We've looked at this a lot within the design of the various systems. We can only validate information for the products that we hold. So if we get a request through and it says telephone number XYZ, as Fred Blogs Telecom got it, we can say that. We have no idea of the broadband. The systems have been designed to talk to one wholesaler as a proxy. What it might have to do is we become sort of messaging conduits, that we take the information sent by any system or hub or whatever it is, and we take it and just pass it through to you. You pass it back. We don't process it, we don't touch it. We only enact any processes once we receive an order, whether it's a port order or a provisioning order. Again, there is a certain reluctance to do that because there will be information going through our pipe that contains details about services you don't have with us, and there may be a certain sensitivity towards that. But again, it's a very difficult one. It's up to you to manage your suppliers. It's up to you to manage the supply chain, but we would like to take some of that weight off you as a wholesaler. So to finish up, you know, everything's on the go at once. We're changing systems, we're changing products, we're developing new products, we're having to engage new switching systems. As a wholesaler, we have to try and help you out. We're still not sure though what our role is and how we can best complete that role. And further engagement and further discussions have to be had with retailers to what information they can give us and what they actually want their wholesaler to provide. It goes from, you need to do it all for us, to, we're not doing anything, we're not giving you any information about our customers. You tell us, we'll decide if that customer can switch. So yeah, it's a case of watch this space, and hopefully within the next 2 to 3 months, we should have an answer for you. That's it from me, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lee. What we're going to do is go to a panel session now. So can panelists please turn on their cameras? And just a reminder, attendees, please rain any questions you've got in the Q&A boxes on your screen, so we'll try and work through them. Now, I'll have a look.
Quite a lot of questions.
We have got a lot of questions, and I'll do my best to sort of kick them off in what I believe to be sort of priority order. So the panel's ready, and we'll try and make it as interactive as possible. Paul, I think the first question should start off with you. It says, what costs will we as a reseller have to pay to use the switching hub for residential and potentially also simple business switches? And what is known or planned about charging CPs? Could it be a charge for each switch? Could it be a hub registration fee or something else?
Look, I understand the question, Steve. It's a very good question. I can't announce now until I'd have to answer the whole industry simultaneously what the charging model will be. All I will say is, you know, I recognise the need for it to be a manageable sum and to be fair. You know, and the models that you've mentioned there are obvious candidates.
Okay. Megan, I think the next one's probably for you. As we approach the implementation date, whatever that is, how can FCS members keep informed about the gaining provider-led business switching progress and what we need to be planning for and when?
So for FCS members, we obviously run regular calls updating members. We also publish documents behind the members log on our website. For non-members, the gaining provider-led business steering group will be coming out to industry with more information, and we will start publishing documents and such like. So there will be more information. I think, Lee, did you have anything to add to that? I think that's
just that. As to the when, as of now, it's April 2023, and that's it.
Okay.
And until we receive any more information, that's when it's going to happen. And to be clear, the regulation will not change. What Ofcom might do is change some of the enforcement action in April 2023.
But they haven't given any indication of that
Yeah,
so far.
but I think what they have been quite clear of is that the statement stands. The action they take for compliance could change.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put two questions together here. So the question is, and I think this is possibly for Dave and anybody else who wants to chip in. If I understand this, the TOTSCO hub is a messenger. If the TOTSCO hub does not store the data but just transmits it, how is the receiver able to verify that they've received all the messages sent? And if the receiver loses a message, will they be able to go back and ask for retransmission? And also, how does the transmitter know that the message has been received, if you see what I mean? So really all about messaging there, and how we'll know that the message has gone, been received, that we've got all the required messages.
This is where I use the paradigm of the post office again. We're treating messaging very much like a registered delivery type service, that when you send a message, TOTSCO takes the responsibility of ensuring that message is delivered. The hub, I should say, rather than TOTSCO. So it will hold all messages that it has for a designated recipient and continually try sending those to that recipient. Now, there will be policies assigned to the messages, such that if there's a failure to deliver, after a period of time, it will send a notification back to the sender to let them know that it's had trouble delivering it, and it will continue to retry. Now, certain messages in the message flows, we will set timeout policies on. For example, the matching messages for consumer, where consumer has a 60-second SLA. What we'll probably do is put a 5-minute timeout, for example, on those messages, that if we continue to try to send those messages and they can't be delivered after 5 minutes, TOTSCO will discard those and send a message back to the hub, rather. We'll send a message back to the originator of that message saying that message was failed to be delivered. So the sender will always have complete confidence in that the message is delivered, because TOTSCO, the hub's responsibility is to take it and to deliver it. From the losing provider's perspective, they have to trust that the hub is delivering all messages for them. They can't know that they've missed a message, because they must be acknowledging the receipt in the same way that the hub acknowledges receipt from the sender. So there's a handoff process that happens every stage. The sender sends a message to the hub, and the hub acknowledges it back to the sender. So the sender knows that the hub has taken responsibility for delivering it. When the hub sends it to the recipient has to acknowledge back to the hub that I have received it. I have now taken responsibility. This is a traditional mechanism in IT messaging to ensure that there is a guaranteed delivery of message, that you do not remove it from your process flow until the recipient is guaranteed that they have actually taken that message. Now, that might mean that as the recipient of that message, you may have to implement some sort of caching mechanism or persistence mechanism, so that if you have a system failure, you do not lose your copy of that message. You have a responsibility, having received that message, to make sure that it gets processed. Once you take responsibility, once you take receipt of that message and you acknowledge it back to the hub will wipe it for its cache. It will have nothing more to do with it. It's your responsibility to process. So in the same way that you put a message in a letterbox, it's the post office's deliberate responsibility to deliver it to you. Once they put it through your letterbox, post office has got nothing more to say about it. So we followed exactly the same principles.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Another question, and I'm sort of skipping between a number of questions. Will residential status be determined at the time of the request? So, you know, there's no permanent marker on the line, and a res could become a business, and a business could become a res going forward. So how does the system determine that it's a residential order as such?
It's, well, I mean, Ofcom within the statement, you know, they recommend that the best way to identify the type of services by the contract that is signed with the losing provider. Now, the gaining provider may not have any visibility of that, and it has nothing to do with the sale, the service that they're actually selling. But it does introduce that complexity if you're selling a residential service and the previous contract was on business, and that business provider is not on the hub, then that is an exception that has to be dealt with. You will not be able to use the BAU one-touch switch process for that.
And this is what I meant about your gaining provider-led journey. So at the point of sale, as a gaining provider, you're going to need to capture what the customer is, a customer is a residential, because there's no markers anywhere, is there?
And the further complexity is that each end of the supply chain will follow the process that they have to deem by the contract they're signing. So if the gaining provider is signing a residential contract, they will follow the rules around the residential contract in terms of the information flow and the processes to follow. The losing provider will follow the processes applicable to that contract type. So if they have a business contract, they will follow the processes they have to follow for that, which are noticeably different in some cases to what the residential provider has to do. Now, what we're trying to do within the steering group is give some guidance and best practice, which matches very closely in terms of things like implications of switching, etc. But to be clear, they are two completely different processes. The only common ground is they're both GPL.
Can I just make one call out on this topic from an OpenReach perspective, if you don't mind me jumping in quickly?
Yeah, no, jump, please.
From an OpenReach perspective, we treat an order as an order. So we won't differentiate between a business and a residential customer. And that's really important for the FCS members to recognise. We will just do as instructed. That's really important. We will be making changes to our systems and processes. It's important that CPs are aware of that and they consume it and act accordingly. And
also throughout the supply chain, the wholesalers sell a product to a retail CP. We have no idea who they're selling it to. We assume it's business. In Gamma's case, it may not be. There's nothing else you can do. But it's down to the contract that retail CP sells to the end user as to what action they have to take.
This question is really for Paul and Dave, I think, because, you know, Paul mentioned in his update that there will only be an API interface to the hub, and the question, and Dave in his presentation mentioned a portal access. So the question from our members is, will there be a portal access to the one-touch switching hub to enable the smaller resellers who will not have the API interface to utilize it, basically?
If I can take that one, please, Stephen, try and clear that. So both are true. So technically, the only way of accessing the messaging function is via an API. That was what I was trying to communicate when I started talking about indirect access. So we recognize, Totsko recognizes that you need access to this, because if you don't have access to the hub, you can't really participate in the market, because you can't participate in switching. So we are currently surveying people to understand what their plans are for access, whether they're building their own APIs, whether their OSS, BSS supplier will do that for them. And if there is a residual need, then we will work with industry to make sure that something is available to give the basic level of access to the hub messaging functions. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We've got one now on business switching, which is sort of Megan and Lee and perhaps Dave as well. Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, just I think, well, just a clarification. That is for residential only. There is no, when you're talking about basic access, it's for residential services. That's correct, isn't it? I think I just want to make that caveat.
I'm not sure that's right, Itre, because as we've said before, it will provide access. I mean, how the hub is used by business-facing CPs is a big question, which we've discussed quite a lot today. But to provide access to the hub functions, messaging functions, I think, to use a phrase that Dave used, is really agnostic as to what it's being used for. It's providing access to the messaging functions.
All right, that's interesting. Thank you. So the basic is agnostic about what goes across it. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That's where, sorry, just going back to that little slide I had with a picture of all of the bits talking to each other and all the participants. We can engage with TPIs. It doesn't have to be Totsko that delivers our portal. That's something that we are probably going to actively have to look at to facilitate this, but it's not Totsko that's looking to develop and procure a hub.
I think, yes. Sorry, Dave, on that one though, I think the one thing that we've all got to be cognizant of is that you are not penalised commercially. So as soon as you introduce the third party, there is a charge potentially involved, which raises your cost to provide. Does that make you less competitive potentially? So it's something we have to bear in mind when we look at solutions.
Absolutely.
Because this is not a choice. If you're a residential provider, this is a regulatory obligation. So should you have to pay more to consumer regulatory obligation? That's all for discussion.
Okay. I've got another few to get through, so I'll try to be quick. For business switching, I think Lee and Megan, your thoughts on this. If a reseller is switching wholesale suppliers, so no change of end user or reseller, would the business switching process still need to be followed?
No.
No.
Yeah.
If you look at today, there's some confusion. I think we've had this discussion many times on number portability. Ofcom do not recognise wholesale number portability. It is only on change of retail provider. So switch is on the change of retail provider, not the supplier of services.
Yeah, so it's who is billing the end customer. That's what changes. That's a switch. We will be defining it properly in our documentation. Okay,
thank you. This is quite a hard hitting question, but this seems to be sort of quite a hastily and as yet unfinished project. Should Ofcom not step in to delay the launch until this is ironed out? Because the retailer, will have to write and implement the API, and yet none of this has been produced. And when do you see the documentation being readily available to us? Anybody can take that one.
The documentation's available now. It's on the Totsko website for the API structures. They're draft at the moment, but they're very close to the finished versions for the consumer process, I should state. We're hoping to get to a draft message model over the next month or so, but we've obviously got to have conversations with Topsco about the use of the hub first. But we haven't ruled out all other mechanisms such as Excel spreadsheets for switches via email. But we recognise that we've got to get that defined relatively quickly. So the first part is what we're working on is the process. That will define the content that we need for the business switching, and from that will define the messaging and the document structures. So I don't know if anyone else from the working group wants to comment on timelines, but
well, I would have to say that there are a number of meetings going on between various parties from residential and business with Ofcom at the moment, discussing implementation. But as far as we know, it's April 2023.
Yeah.
Been given any indication of any delays?
No.
And I think this is the reason why I suppose you're asked to actually develop at risk. I mean, you wouldn't, in a normal circumstance, you would have everything in place. But I think the approach that industry is taking is they're providing as much information, but there's a risk if you start developing that, and you need to recognize that risk. And so unfortunately, unless Ofcom tells us otherwise, that's the approach that's been taken.
I think to add, I think we as industry are trying to provide the right support to enable CPs to progress with that development. So probably a call out from an Openreach systems perspective, we will have capability there in December for CPs to test against. And I think, Paul, you probably called out that there is capability from a Tosco perspective that people can develop against as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear, industry has not been dragging its feet on this. For the past 3 years, we've been putting in, I mean, from a personal perspective, it's been all consuming probably for the past 2 years.
Yes.
To the point where I don't even want to hear the word switch. But we put in an enormous amount of effort, both from the residential and the business, and people like Dave have spent hundreds of hours working on the design principles. It's just not a quick process.
No, I mean, and
the major thing for the residential market, this is a big bang. So your interoperability testing, your testing is probably going to have to be as long, if not longer, than the development process to make sure it all works.
And I would say this, Lee, it's not just big bang for residential, it's big bang for business, because they are very closely linked in terms of, as you have already stated, sometimes the definition of what that customer is very unclear in the beginning.
And in terms of Openreach systems, the NLT Plus process cannot differentiate between a business and a residential line. So we either take it away for all, or we have to return it for all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But coming back, we still not heard anything from Ofcom.
I'm going to do one more question, then we're going to move on to the second session. But I think we never minded going over slightly on this session because it was important. But Megan, it's a question for you. And the member says, you know, at the moment we have to carefully project manage large, complex business switches. And why shouldn't we, and will we be allowed to just carry on doing this going forward?
So you can carry on, you will definitely carry on project managing, but you need to make sure all your processes are gaining provider led, and you need to make sure that you adhere to the regulations. So if what you're currently doing does, fine, but I would doubt it. There isn't a gaining provider led solution available at the moment for switching IaaS across networks, for example. So it's about your conversations with the gaining or losing party. So I think that you would still need to change some things, unless it's purely number porting. But even then, Lee, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would say for complex, it's down to what the customer wants. So if the customer wants both parties to manage it, you don't necessarily have to follow. If the customer says, please just work together and sort this one out, but I'm still talking to both parties and I still need to engage with both parties, that's not going to change. And that's typically what we see in enterprise. You know, these are lengthy switches, lengthy migrations, need a lot of discussion and coordination between both parties. Is it a switch? we are having these discussions now is how long do you keep concurrent services running? Is that a switch, or is it parallel running where you're actually paying 2 bills at the same time? So we're still trying to bottom these out and work through these. And we have sort of presented these scenarios to Ofcom, and we've got some more sessions with them to run through as to what their opinion is of what is a switch and what's not a switch.
And just to round it, it's at the product level effectively. So that's what you're saying, Lee, because the thing is, some are product level type of decisions, whether it's going to be a switch, and some others are in terms of whether it's been retained or not.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, who's going to go online and switch the whole business over through, you know, going on to a new provider and do it? It's going to be coordinated. You know, your business relies on this. You know, your life is your numbers and connectivity. Otherwise, your business doesn't function. You're not just going to go and see Fred Logs Telecom has got a nice online portal. I'll go and order a new service for my 20 shops. That's not going to change.
And you might want to retain some services still with your losing provider anyway.
Yeah, because the one thing that has changed, and I forgot to mention when we were talking about separation, is that you may sell software licenses. Some of those licenses, those seats may carry a voice service, some may not. So when you switch, you only switch the numbers, not the software license, because they will return functionality that still works. One of the facilities is MBIX, you know, a voice service, but it will still function without that number.
Yeah.
And that introduces complexity about how the customer interacts with his existing provider or losing provider to cancel those services.
And there's other things such as call recordings and Ellie, and so yeah, there are some complexities around that. Exactly.
Okay, thanks, Megan. What I'm going to do is call this first session to a close, and what we're going to do is go into a 5-minute comfort break. So we'll come back just after 10:02. And on your screens, you will see some polling questions, and they're only quick ones, but it does help us to capture your thoughts and views on how useful this session is and really formulate what we do going forward. So we're going to start the next session, the move to all IP, at 14:53. How's that in just 5 minutes time? And so we'll have a quick break now, and we'll come back to Juliet's slot. Thanks.